So we know from the first law of demand that there exists an inverse relationship between the price of a good and the amount of it that's actually demanded, or the quantity demanded. But one thing we might want to know is, like, how responsive to changes in price are people. Okay. And to measure this, economists have created or come up with a concept that we call elasticity. Okay. And what it's equal to is mildly complex. Sounds a lot more complicated than it actually is. What it is it's the percent change in quantity divided by the percent change in price. Okay. So let's pretend that a 10% price cut leads to a 20% increase in quantity demanded. Okay. Well, okay, we have the elasticity, which I'll just call E. In this case is equal to 20% divided by negative 10%, which is equal to negative 2. Okay. Now, for the most part, economists will usually ignore this, the negative sign here, not because it's not accurate, but because when we're talking about the elasticity of demand with respect to price, we all know the negative sign exists, and so we might actually just call this just 2. Okay, but this is because, again, we know the negative sign is there, and we're just kind of being lazy and telling ourselves and saving ourselves some breath here. Okay, so we do know it exists, but if you ever hear that the elasticity of demand is equal to 2 or some other positive number, do realize that they're usually just omitting the negative sign, just because we all know it's there. Okay. Now, elasticity, so let's talk about this. Elasticity is not the slope of the demand curve. Okay. There is some relationship between the slope of the demand curve and the elasticity, but it is not at all determined by the slope of the demand curve. Elasticity is all about the percent change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price. Okay, all demand curves, whether there's a steep demand curve or a less steep or a shallow demand curve, all demand curves have an inelastic region and an elastic region. Okay. Now, so elastic demand, right? This is where the elasticity, so elasticity is greater than 1. Okay, here's kind of the interesting result. Okay, with elastic demand, if you lower the price, total revenue will increase. Okay, remember that total revenue is equal to price times quantity. And here's kind of the way to think about this. If the elasticity is greater than 1, then that means that for a small change in price, you're going to get a relatively large increase in quantity, or change in quantity. And so if this is the case where the price goes down and the quantity demanded goes up by more than the price goes down, then your total revenue will actually increase. Conversely, if you raise the price by a little bit, the quantity demanded will actually go down by quite a bit, and your total revenue will actually decrease. Okay? Inelastic demand is the opposite. Okay, this is where the elasticity is less than 1, In this case, if you let's say if you raise your price, then total revenue will increase, right? And this is because if we again have, total revenue is equal to price times quantity, what this is saying is you could raise your price by quite a bit and it's only going to decrease quantity by a little bit, and so the result will be that your total revenue will actually increase. Okay, so if you are in an elastic portion of the demand curve, then you actually will make more money by lowering your price. And if you're in the inelastic region of the demand curve, you will make more money by raising your price because the decrease in quantity will be much smaller. Okay? Most people tend to think that every firm is in the inelastic region of the demand curve, and I'm not really sure why. Okay? Everyone seems to think that all firms are in the inelastic region, but the truth is really that they're more likely in the elastic region. Okay? And so that's just an interesting side note for all of this. Now, so we have the first law of demand. So let's get into the second law of demand, which is my personal favorite of the laws of demand. The second law of demand is probably my favorite. The third is one of the more clever ones, but the second is my favorite. Okay? So the second law of demand states that elasticity of demand with respect to price, so I should say that, respect to price is greater in the long run than in the short run. Okay, so what this says in other words, what this says is that in the short run, behavior probably doesn't change much, right? In this case, behavior being a proxy for quantity demanded, doesn't change much in response to a change in price. In the long run, however, behavior, which is again basically just quantity demanded in this context, can and does change more in response to a change in price. Okay, so in other words, we alter our behavior a lot more in the long run than we do in the immediate or short run. Okay, so the textbook here gives a great example of gasoline. Okay, so let's consider the price of gasoline and your behavior. Okay, so you drive about the same amount immediately after an increase in the price of gas because you don't have much time to figure out an alternative means of getting around town. So let's say you have to drive to work every day or you have to drive to school, and if the price of gas were to increase, you're probably not going to alter your behavior all that much that day, right? You might drive a little bit less, but certainly not by much. You're still going to drive to work, which for most of us is the bulk of our experience for driving. But after a long enough time with the increased price in gas, you will you'll figure out ways to either drive less, so maybe you'll take the bus, or you might carpool with a friend, right? Or you'll figure out ways to use less gas when driving. So perhaps you switch to a more fuel efficient vehicle, right? Or you might even move closer to work or wherever you go the most often. Or perhaps you find ways to reduce the weight of your car.